and welcome to this week's episode of the Maine Challenge. You know, the attack on voting rights and our democracy continues. Even our own Maine Senator Angus King is warning of possible autocracy and the slide towards that if we don't pass the Voting Rights Act. And you know, the thing is, it continues to be a problem, but it didn't just start recently. This has been a planful march of attack on voting rights for years, actually. And so this week, we're taking a look back at a couple of interviews that we've done. One with Heather Cox Richardson, truth teller extraordinaire, historian extraordinaire, who sort of foretold of this potential weeks, months, years before it even really started to be in the public eye. And then we go back to an interview that we had with Rob Ryers and Michael Owens, who also talked about what was happening more recently this past fall. And Rob Ryers is a Republican. He was the head of the brand new Congress. And Michael Owens is now running for the Secretary of State in Georgia on the same ballot as Stacey Abrams as they run to take over governor and Secretary of State to try and preserve democracy in the state of Georgia. So take a look at these interviews, think about where we've been, and then we'll look ahead to where we're going. And in the sounds off at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about what Maine Challenge is looking forward to in the new year and some new changes in programming and the way we're going to do things as we get through what promises to be another challenging year. Happy New Year. Thanks for being with us, and take a look.
Welcome to Maine Challenge, Professor Richardson.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be here. What exciting times we're living in, huh?
Well, that's true. It's not boring.
So I actually have a lot of faith in polling, and let me explain why. I just saw your eyebrows go up, and let me explain why I think polling matters. And that's that pollsters are actually really good. I mean, some of them are just partisan polls, and they're designed to change the political narrative, and those you can dismiss. But the aggregate polls, the ones that are going to be aggregated by major newspapers or by 538 or by any of the places that one looks, tend to be really, really good. And they matter because what they tell us is how Americans as a whole are thinking about certain issues, and not simply about the election, but also about all kinds of issues. I mean, they basically poll how many, flakes per stomach of cereal you put, in your mouth every morning. I mean, they poll everything. But why that matters for a political contest is that our electoral system does not, in fact, reflect the way people are thinking because of the bastardization of the Electoral College, and that doesn't operate now the way it was designed to operate. So we don't get necessarily in the presidency the person who's won the popular vote or the person who actually reflects what people want. We get that from pollsters, and that is, I think, a really important thing for people to keep in mind, because pollsters can say, hey, listen, even though the electoral vote went for this candidate, in fact, if you actually look at what people want, they actually wanted this and these policies. And I think it's a really important check on what we understand about, political beliefs. What does concern me deeply is that this is the first time in American history that we have a president who is making no pretense at all of winning the popular vote. Nobody is pretending that President Donald Trump is trying to win the popular vote. Everybody is very aware that he is trying to get reelected by making sure that Democratic votes don't get counted. And this is a big issue, regardless of whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. I mean, if you have a democracy and one party refuses to permit the votes of the other party to be counted, you don't have a democracy any longer. And the reason that matters for a democracy is that you need to have two healthy parties, because you need to make sure that people who disagree with the people in power have a legitimate way to say, hey, I disagree with you, and I can elect enough people to rule, the country myself. And if they don't have that, they're not going to be continuing to oppose the people in power by legitimate means. They're going to start to use to violence and all sorts of other things. And I'm just talking theoretically here. The other reason you want the two healthy parties is because you want to make sure that the party in power, Republican or Democratic, has a check on how it behaves. And think about one-party states like North Korea or like Russia. There's no check on how those people operate. Every once in a while, they send out a member of the party to sort of, give a public confession, and basically that's simply performative. I mean, that doesn't actually reform the party in power at all. So it concerns me a lot that we are in a place where a president is trying to win re-election without actually winning the popular vote, or even trying to win the popular vote, but rather by silencing his opponents. And if you look at his language, and this is where I'm going with the whole thing about the recounting or the counting after the election comes in. If you look at his language, he is deliberately setting up exactly what you just said. The idea that on the night of the election, it might look like Republicans have won, but as votes keep coming in, including votes from our military, by the way, those make up the bulk of the votes that come in after the day of the election. They must be postmarked by the election, but they come in after because they're coming a long way. That as those votes are counted, it's called the blue wave, actually comes after the election when these votes come in. He is trying to set up the idea that that is a flipping or a turning of the election. And you saw that last week with Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who said, oh, you can't do this because you're going to have the impression that it's going to flip the election. To which people are pushing back and saying, no, it doesn't flip the election. It's simply counting the ballots. And one of the things that I would really emphasize for everybody is that one of the things that is fascinating for a historian about the Trump administration, but it's not unique to him, it's been a project on the GOP side for a while now, is to create reality. If you say it enough, it becomes true. And that's, the scholars of language and rhetoric and politics all know about how one does that. The more you repeat it, the more people think, oh yeah, it's true. And he is trying to make that true. He's trying to make people believe that. And it's really important to push back on that and to push back with the reality that no, you are not flipping the election if you're counting all the votes. No, you are not cheating if you are waiting for the states to certify the votes, because actually it's not the media that decides who has won these elections. It is the states when they certify those votes, and those votes are never certified, never. Even if it's 100-0, they are never certified on the first day. They're certified when the state has actually counted all the ballots. So that's what we should be looking for. If people are looking to the media, there is one thing to remember, and that is that lots of media channels, including the Fox News channel, which, as I keep saying to people, has in its terms of service that it is for entertainment purposes only. They might call elections, but they have no authority. They call elections based on what they call projections. So they could say, oh, look, we've got 37% of the votes in, but the people that are left out there to have their votes counted are in urban areas, and they tend to vote Democratic, so we're going to call this for the Democrats. That's a projection. Now, they could be wrong. Everybody in Milwaukee could vote Republican. They don't know that. And so those are not real calls. Those are guesses. And they're often right, but they're guesses. I mean, I could do the same thing and you'd be an idiot to believe me. The one group who does have a different method than that is the Associated Press, the AP. And when the AP makes a call, they don't look at what is likely. They literally claim anyway to say, that was a horrible way to put that. Their methodology is that they look at a race and they say, is there any possible way for the other person to win? So it might be that there's only 75% of the votes in, or even 51% of the votes in, but every single one of them is for the Republican candidate. If that's the case, and they wouldn't do it on a margin of 51%, I'm making that up, say it's 75%. If that's the case, even if every single other ballot came in Democratic, that Republican would still win. So they're like little mice going, what if we went down this angle? What if we went down this angle? What if we went down this angle? And when they say, no, there are no other angles by which the other person could win, then they will call a race. And it sounds like I'm splitting hairs there, but if you think about that, that's a really different methodology. One is cool, but likely, but really unreliable. And the other is pretty ironclad. Well, so yeah, I love this topic actually. So there's two things at stake, and one is exactly what you said. The idea of having a national ID card is kind of a no-brainer. If you think about it, virtually every other country has one. And in fact, people, conservatives, and by that I don't, if you ever care, I can explain to you why I differentiate conservatives from Republicans, but I
Right.
do. I work in ideas a lot, and the two don't overlap right now. But conservatives really objected to the idea of a national ID card because they believed it was the overreach of the state. So that in fact, Democrats at the time and some liberals wanted there to be a national ID, and the conservatives said, not happening on our watch because that's overreach by the state. So now, of course, when you say you shouldn't have to have an ID, their reaction is, oh, you want just anyone to vote. And the answer is, if we could actually give everybody a national ID, then it seems like it would make sense to have to be able to be identified at the polls. But you can't really have it both ways, because what you're saying is state legislatures get to decide what is a legitimate ID and there's a bunch of ways to rein that in. So in Texas, for example, you can use your hunting license, but you can't use your student ID card. That's just not considered something that's a legitimate ID. Well, you can see right there what's happening. Similarly, the one that just frosts my shorts is that in certain times in Texas, you have been required to have your name exactly match your ID, which again, no brainer, right? Although lots of us can't remember if we use our middle names or not, but not necessarily a huge deal. But whose name changes a lot? Women's, because women get divorced and married and they change their names, and that means that they can't vote based on their former ID. And you say, well, they should get their acts together and get the new ID. Well, yeah, it's fairly expensive in Texas to get a new ID. But the story behind how that happened is, I think, really instructive, because we get the Republican focus on what they called voter integrity, if you remember that, in 1986. Before the midterms of 1986. And the reason that they did that was because we tend to forget it now, the lost in the hagiography of the past. But the Republican tax cuts of the Reagan years were not popular. I mean, they in popular media, they made it sound like they were popular. They were not popular. People did not think trickle-down economics was going to work. And if you recall, after the initial Reagan tax cut, the economy went into the toilet, not entirely because of those tax cuts, although that had a lot to do with it. But people were not at all convinced that this whole tax cut thing was going to work. So when they go to make the 86 tax cuts, which is the other major round of tax cuts during the Reagan years, when they do that, the Republicans recognize that they've got a real problem for the midterms, and they actually go on this effort to have what they call voter integrity. And we have the memos from that. There was a lawsuit about those. And in the memos, there are people from the Republican National Committee who are saying, listen, if we do this, we think we can knock a significant number of Black people off the voting rolls, and that means we're going to keep Republicans in power. And that idea of focusing on fraud then gets picked up in the 1990s, in the early 1990s. There's a little place in between as well that I'm not going to go into because it's a little bit in the weeds, unlike everything else I'm talking about. But in 1993, with the motor voter law under Clinton, the Republicans start to insist that the Democrats are forcing voters who shouldn't be voting into the system. Now think about that. Should people vote or not? It's a democracy. Yes, they should vote. But the motor voter law encourages people to sign up for registration when they register their cars, but also you can register in places like welfare offices. So there was this idea that somehow the Democrats were packing the vote. And after that, the Republicans, especially under Newt Gingrich, begin to say that every time a Democrat wins, they're only winning because of voter fraud. Now there is, again, for the millionth time, you are far more likely to get hit by lightning than for there to be voter fraud. But it's incredibly rare, and it's usually accidental. Somebody doesn't recognize that they're registered in one place and they vote in another, or there's all kinds of not all kinds of, there are a few accidents every year, but it is infinitesimal. But you may or may not remember, during the Gingrich years, there were two cases that they made a point of, one in the Senate and one in the House, where in both cases women had been elected, Democratic women had been elected, And the Republicans, who controlled both the House and the Senate at that time, started investigations claiming that they had been fraudulently elected. And they kept those elections going all year. So they're out in front of the cameras all year going, hey, where there's fraud here, there wasn't. And at the end of the day, the investigations close, and they say, well, we couldn't prove it because they hid the evidence, but we know it was there. And here's what I was talking about creating your own reality. You're seeing it on the news every single night. You know, it's every single, and people think, oh my God, we've got voter fraud. So what happens on the heels of that is really interesting, because at the end of the 1990s, there is a mayoral race in Miami, Florida. And there aren't actually even any Democrats in it. There's a Republican and an independent. They're both Cuban Americans, as I recall. And the thing is just laced with fraud on both sides. Lots of people go to jail. And that really adds teeth in Florida to the idea of voter fraud. And as I say, nobody argued that that election was not corrupt. It just was. But that's about Florida, really. It's not about national politics. And on the heels of that, the Florida legislature in 1998 puts into practice or writes a voter ID law. And listen to that date, 1998. And as it is implemented, it's interesting. I actually have gotten communications from people who were on the team implementing it, and they identified on the voter rolls people whose names didn't match or whatever. It was people that they should have reached out to, but instead all those people got purged. And a government investigation after the 2000 election, from the government, not from a partisan group, one side or the other, estimated that as many as 100,000 voters got kicked off the Florida voting rolls, and most of them, the guess is, because again you don't know who isn't there any longer, considering where they came from, it looks like they were primarily Democrats. All right, now what happens in 2000? The election comes down to Florida. At the end of the day, it comes down to 327 voters. And again, that was the days of the hanging chads and the butterfly ballot, which is enormously confusing. And you look at that and you just say, I didn't pay a lot of attention to that when I was living through it. And when I just wrote a book before this one on the Republican Party, and I look at that election and I think, that's where they figured it worked. And do you know who went down to stop the recounting of those ballots? Because when they recounted them, of course, Gore was going ahead. You know who was part of the recount process?
James Baker.
James Baker, but you're aiming way too high. Roger Stone.
Of course.
Roger Stone, who did that. And he gave, if anybody's interested, he gave a number of interviews to the Miami Herald about that. They had a whole beat on Roger Stone in the 1900s, I think it was. And he talks about it, and he's like, that's why I love Nixon. That Gore was all high-minded about protecting democracy, and we were just out for the kill, and that's how you got to run politics.
This is the day after the insurrection, the terrorist attack, whatever you want to call it, the seditious action of thousands of people in the Capitol. And I think we're all still trying to understand it and understand its impact. But I figured if we didn't talk about it, it'd be like saying to Mrs. Lincoln, "Oh, other than that, how did you like the play?" So let me just turn to you guys and just ask. So I know it's still early. It's less than 24 hours since this actually happened. But what are you making of what we saw yesterday? And Rob, I'll start with you.
Yeah, thank you, Betsy. It's so great to chat with you and Michael, and I look forward to hearing both of your insights as well. I'm in a place right now where I'm still, in a lot of ways, just kind of processing my feelings about what we watched unfold yesterday. I know yesterday I was so angry. That was kind of the overwhelming feeling that I had. Anger at the people who were making such a mockery of our process, anger at the hypocrisy of like the law and order crowd acting so lawlessly, anger at the president for inciting this, and members of Congress who know better inciting it, and anger, quite frankly, that some of my friends' lives were in danger. And all three of us know people who were in Congress and were in the chamber, and getting texts from friends, saying, "Hey, I'm okay. I'm in a safe place now." It just really, really made me angry, knowing that these are good public servants who are trying to put the needs of people first and make a difference in our country, and to have these, terrorists, these lawless, misguided terrorists incited by the president of the United States, threatening their lives and well-being. I just so much anger. And there's a lot to unpack politically,
yes,
and the implications of all of that. But I have just kind of been sitting in just my emotions about all of this.
Yeah. And I think that's where we have to stay. And Michael, I just want to say that I want to ask you about this, but I just want to say one of the things that made me so angry was that the work that you did and thousands of others to turn Georgia blue. We have this unprecedented thing where we have a African-American Black senator elected from Georgia. We have 2 Democratic senators. I mean, that should be the frontline news for months from now. And we got robbed of that. You got robbed of that. We all got robbed of that because of what happened. What is your take on what we saw yesterday?
Yeah, first of all, you're exactly right. Thank you. And thank you for having me on and being with Rob. It was a fantastic opportunity. So thank you. And yeah, to your point, it was a letdown, right? It was some frustration. First of all, it was the first day after, a historic election. And so we're in the day after mode, right? Which should be quite celebratory. It's, it's reaching out, touching with folks. It's kind of cleaning up, tidbits here and there. And instead, right, it became a agonizing, terrifying aspect for all of us, for each and every one of us, especially as you mentioned, and as Rob mentioned, for those of us who have friends that literally are in Congress, and for people that we know that work on the Hill, and, not even members of Congress, but other people that we know, staff and aides and others, made it for a very terrifying event. But more so than that, it's to me, their safety, of course, is paramount. But what this did for me was it is the icing on the cake when it comes to what's been the worst presidential administration in the history of this country, right? And it also has gone to me thinking about it and watching this kind of unfold. I was actually having lunch with some volunteers, really hard, dedicated people, and they're looking at the TV over my shoulder, and I'm not seeing real time what's happening. They are. And they're just like, Michael, that's good stuff you're talking about, but you need to stop and turn around. Like they're literally broken into the Capitol. So I guess my point is that President Trump's actions over these last 4 years has normalized this type of activity to where when we reach full insurrection, literally breaking into the people's house, it's almost treated as another novelty. And again, I'm like, Rob, I haven't fully processed this yet, but my first inclination to view this has been normalized way too much, right? This is a national travesty. This is all. I saw pictures yesterday of people wearing shirts that said Civil War. I mean, the call was clear. The actions were clear. So for us to see it as anything less, to see it as supporters that were upset or misguided, no, these were people who literally, actively took an approach to take over this government. And the fact that, here we are, however many hours later, not exactly treating it as such.
Yeah, exactly.
That's bothersome to me. That's bothersome.
Yeah, no, it's very disturbing. And I think that normalizing, and again, this is, something that has been in the making. And where my anger went, well, all those places were 2 other places that you guys have mentioned. And one is that, all the people who were complicit in this over the last 4 years, my own senator who I ran against, Susan Collins, and, who just have said nothing and like, oh, well, we hope he learned his lesson. Oh, well, oh, isn't he terrible? But, my 401k is doing really well. And, you just,
right.
Totally dismissing that. And so I think being complicit in this, I think this is on their hands as well. And then the other thing, and I know it's not lost on any of us, but watching, the events of last summer when we were all protesting for Black Lives Matter and how we were treated as peaceful protesters, and then the lack of any, with Army Guard, National Guard, millions of them, it seemed like, surrounding the Capitol, and we're making sure. And here we were with insurrection that had been talked about and planned and advertised, and the president said go. And
Yes.
and we see Capitol Police opening barriers for people and taking selfies with protesters. The disparity between the treatment of how we treat white insurrectionists and how we treat people of color and allies who are trying to bring about justice. It's stunning. It's just absolutely stunning. So
I think it's all linked together, Betsy. I mean, if you look at what you mentioned from the Black Lives Matter, and how people that are fighting for justice and fighting for people that have, against police injustice, and you look at that, and let alone the announcement that came out surrounding that and the timeliness of that as well, you start to see these things are connected, and least of us to be the conspiracy theorists, but these aren't conspiracists, right? These are facts. We are grounded in factual information that comes out and how responses to things are handled. And here in Georgia, again, it hits home with us, because we did have Senator, shall I say, soon to be former Senator Loeffler, who was one of those who were advocating for it. We had several Congress people, including Congressman Barry Loudermilk, who just a couple of days ago was talking about how he was going back to Washington and how he was going to, speak to the will of the people of his district. And it was like, the people of your district voted, for both candidates, but they lost. This was truly the will of the people. So again, to kind of go back here and have President Trump attacking our governor, who is a Republican in his own party, having him going against our Secretary of State, and we all know about the phone calls now. So this is heightened because we also see the level at which the president and his cronies have been willing to go to stay in power, and then emboldening people, as you mentioned before, that are that are the good people on both sides, right? Or the stand by, stand back and stand by is exactly what we saw. So this type of information, like I said, didn't come from anywhere, and it was well known, it was well orchestrated, it was well organized and coordinated, and the failure again of whoever, I'm not even going to point fingers right now, whoever was responsible for not heeding this attack for the same way with the peaceful protests that we saw for Black Lives Matter. Again, there needs to be some serious conversations about this at all levels of government.
As we close out this year, I want to say thank you. Thank you for who you are. Thank you for what you do. And thank you for being part of the Maine Challenge viewership. It has been a challenging year. And as we look forward to next year, we know that it too will have its challenges. We will have the continuing pandemic, it looks like, and the lingering mental health and economic effects of that. We are going to have a feisty gubernatorial election and congressional midterms here in Maine and across the country, and every seat in our state legislature will be up for grabs. We also will continue to confront the crisis of climate change, inadequate health care, economic inequality, the need for criminal justice reform, for tribal sovereignty, and so many other issues that we have talked about before, and we will continue to talk about. And here, as we look forward to that year, we are looking forward to adjusting and doing the things that we need to do at Maine Challenge to make sure that we provide the programming that keep you hopeful, helpful, informed, and inspired. So we will be moving to a once every other week format, and one of those weeks we will come from the State House, bringing you information from behind the scenes and from the 35,000-foot view of what's happening and what it means for all of us in our daily lives. And then we will continue to bring you the stories of the people and the things and the issues that continue to lift us up and challenge us to be all that we can be and be the best that we can be here in Maine. We also are going to be expanding our social media presence, so we urge you to follow us, Maine Challenge, on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and eventually TikTok. We ask you to come stay with us and find out, be inspired, be informed, and help us as we chart a path forward for the state of Maine and our wonderful people, and in this nation, again, to be the best that we can be, and so we can be hopeful, helpful, and full of heart. Thank you so much, and Happy New Year. We look forward to spending next year with you.